The script of Max Ophüls' film Le Plaisir was written almost effortlessly, it seems, by Ophüls himself and by Jacques Nathanson, his co-writer, in March and April 1951. From the start, they had decided upon quite unusual structure. The film would be a triptych, where two very short and dense and dark episodes would flank a central story which would be considerably more developed and more joyous. Quite unusual structure, since usually those films tend to be made of episodes of roughly the same length, with the strongest ones or the more spectacular ones kept for the end, which is not the case here. There are two major differences between the script, as it was written at the time, and the film as it was made. The first difference lies in the choice of the third episode. In the film, it is the Maupassant short story, Le Modèle, but in the script, the third episode was another Maupassant short story, La Femme de Paul, which was published, in fact, in the same book of short stories as La Maison Tellier. This choice of La Femme de Paul for the third episode seems rather daring now when we think of the time. To put it briefly, it deals with a young couple, Paul and his girlfriend, Madeleine, who spend their Sundays at La Grenouillère, in a guinguette, one of those boating rendezvous by the river, celebrated by the Impressionist painters. On one Sunday, after they have had a fight, Madeleine lets herself be seduced by a group of lesbians. But when Paul understands her treason, his despair is such that he throws himself into the river and drowns. One can only wonder now how Ophüls could hope that at a time of moral rectitude, such a scandalous subject could be accepted by an audience. The other difference between the script and the film as it was made is no less important. In the script, the three episodes are presented between a prologue and an epilogue, both of which involve two other characters, Maupassant himself and anonymous filmmaker. Maupassant is presented as a disembodied voice coming from nowhere, out of darkness. Much in the same way, in fact, as in the finished film, he will address the audience from the darkness of the cinema theater.
On a cherché divers moyens de vous présenter trois de mes contes. Moi, j'ai pensé que le plus simple était que je vous narre moi-même ces histoires.
As for the filmmaker, he is in the script a real character. He arrives in a car, and he was supposed to be played by Fernand Gravet, who was a very elegant, very handsome, middle-aged actor who had played the husband in Max Ophüls' La Ronde a few months earlier. According to the shooting version of the script, the film was supposed to start one night in Paris, in front of the National Library, with the filmmaker driving in the street in his car, desperate for a subject for his next film. He's stopped by a voice, the Maupassant's voice, coming from nowhere, that it invites itself into the car and engages the conversation. One thing leading to another, they find themselves transported somehow somewhere along the river, covered with mist. And Maupassant proposes a few of his stories to the filmmaker, starting with Le Masque. The two characters reappear again between the episodes to comment upon the story that has just finished or to introduce the following ones. After Le Masque, for instance, the filmmaker concludes, well, it's interesting, but I will not get more than 800 meters out of that, meaning, of course, 25 minutes of screening time. To which Maupassant retorts, yours is a very strange business, but if you buy by the meter, then I shall tell you a longer story. And he starts telling the story of La Maison Tellier, which is indeed much, much longer. At the end of the script, it's Maupassant's voice that comes back after Paul's droning to conclude the story. But there, I must quote directly from the script. Madeleine was weeping. Pauline, she is the main lesbian character, Pauline told her, it's not your fault. You cannot prevent men from acting stupidly. He asked for it. Too bad for him, after all. Then she kissed her and told her, do not cry. We will console you. This, the filmmaker answers, this I will certainly cut out. To which Maupassant's voice concludes, I should not be there to prevent you from doing it. End of quote. It is on the basis of this shooting script that the filming began on June 6, 1951, first with Le Masque, which was shot entirely in the studios in Paris, then with La Maison Tellier, for which the production moved to Normandy, whereas the interiors were also shot in Paris. During that time, a big exterior set was built by the Marne River on the eastern side of Paris, near the Joinville studios for La Femme de Paul, which was scheduled to be the last episode to be shot. In fact, the accumulated delays and shortage of cash brought the production to an end on August the 11th, even before the completion of the Maison Tellier episode. Time was spent trying to find fresh money, and 2 months later, the shooting resumed with a new production company taking over from the very inexperienced one that had started the project. The main consequence of this changeover in the production was the decision to abandon La Femme de Paul and to replace it with another story. When we remember that the very expensive set of La Grenouillère had already been built in Joinville and was ready to shoot, then we must understand that the dumping of La Femme de Paul was a condition for the taking over of the film by a producer who was specializing in family films and certainly not eager to be associated with such a scandalous subject as La Femme de Paul. Ophuls then had no other choice but to look for another short story. And another short story that had to provide parts for the two young stars, Simone Simon and Daniel Gélin, who were already contracted to play Madeleine and Paul. Ophuls chose Le Modèle, which offered several advantages for a production which was now short of money. One of these advantages was that it required very few characters. The other was that many sets could be found in real exteriors in or around Paris, at the École des Beaux-Arts, for instance, or at Trouville for the beach, or along the small lakes at Saint-Cucufa. The choice of Le Modèle also offered the advantage of bringing it a new character, the character of a journalist who, very much in the same way as he does in the original story, appears to be some sort of double for Maupassant himself, thus dissociating the narrator's opinion from the director's point of view. Even when this new version of the script was being written, sometime in September 1951, Ophuls obviously still hoped to be able to film the scenes between Maupassant's voice and the cineast. In this last version of the script, the one that includes Le Modèle, it is still to the cineast that Maupassant's voice tells the story of Jean and Joséphine. But the cineast, who up until then has been presented as a very modern character, driving his car, dressed in 20th century dress, now belongs to Maupassant's world, and he has been transformed and is now dressed in the late 19th century fashion. As for the voice of Maupassant, it is now attributed to the character of a journalist who will tell the story and play his part in it. In the end, a major part of this idea had to be abandoned, either because Fernand Gravet was no longer available to play the part of the filmmaker, but even then, one thinks that he could have been replaced with another actor, or because there was no money or no time left to film these scenes. Maupassant's voice stayed on in the film, and his transformation into the journalist in the third episode. But now, in this third episode, he tells his story to an anonymous friend that nobody knows anything about. As for the filmmaker, his part was just completely cut out. And it's a pity, since he would probably have been very fascinating self-portrait of Max Ophuls himself. Another outcome of this upheaval in the production was the forced replacement of a few key technicians who could not wait for the shooting to resume. And also, most important perhaps, the defection of a popular composer, Maurice Yvain, who had from the start been commissioned to write an original score for the film. He was replaced with a minor arranger, Joe Hios, who satisfied himself by adapting, quite decently in fact, music from the popular repertoire of 19th century operetta. The abandon of La Femme de Paul in favor of Le Modèle had other consequences. One of the most important being that it tipped the scales of sexes in the film definitely towards women's side, whereas the hero and victim in La Femme de Paul would have been the man, contrary to the first two episodes where it is the woman. Then, on the other hand, this decision allowed Ophuls to reconsider the whole architecture of his triptych to make it more perfectly symmetrical. Le Modèle and Le Masque both take place in Paris and in interiors, whereas La Maison Tellier is definitely provincial and shot largely in exteriors. Le Masque and Le Modèle both require a third character, doctor, a journalist, some sort of professional observer of human miseries that the Maison Tellier episode doesn't require. Both Le Masque and Le Modèle divide themselves in two parts, clearly marked with the ascent of a flight of stairs marking the passing of one to the other. Those beautifully calculated symmetries would not have been permitted with La Femme de Paul. But then we must remember that, on the other hand, it would have made things much easier with the dance at the Guinguette for the dance music of Le Masque to come back at the end of the film the way it does much more allusively when the journalist plays it on the piano at the end of Le Modèle. There is no doubt in my mind that Le Plaisir must be one of the most perfectly balanced narrative architecture in the classical cinema. It says a lot about Ophuls' mastery of his art to think that, considering the modifications that he had to bring to his initial project, he still managed, in spite of everything, to keep, after all, his vision intact.